Tom, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here as part of the Asia Policy Assembly and as part of the National Asia Research Program more broadly. And let me just start with the usual caveat that my remarks today represent my own personal views. This is actually not research that's derivative of my work at RAND. In keeping with the theme of the Assembly here, Asia's global influence, how is it exercised, what does it mean? In my paper, I wanted to explore one way of getting a better handle on the future of China's global influence and what the rise of China is going to mean for the rest of the world. And I'm focusing particularly in the area of international security, thinking about the determinants of where China will fight wars, who will be its allies and adversaries, and what will be the main issues on its national security agenda. And what I'm going to argue today is that if we really want to understand the rise of China and China's future behavior, we need to be studying not only Chinese thinking and strategic intentions, but also the international threat environment to which Beijing is going to be forced to respond. So I want to push us into considering the external threat environment in which China will be rising. I'm going to make a methodological point about researching China's rise and then pursue that methodology. The methodological point has to do, again, with the importance of examining emergent external threats. Again, I want to start by saying my argument today is not meant to say that it's superior to or should supplant other approaches. It's not to say domestic politics and preferences don't matter, just that they don't tell the whole story. And this notion stems from my belief that the research and discussion in the U.S. strategic community about the rise of China has paid disproportionate attention to divining Beijing's intentions. We hear this frequently from high-level officials, concerns about Beijing's intentions, most recently last week by Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, last week at the Asia Society. And we hear this in the academic literature as well, where scholars have tended to posit a proactive, willful rising power that will choose the way that it interacts with the predominant order. Now, the cartoon version of this dominant conceptual framework is one in which Beijing has a master plan, and that our goal as scholars is to use some combination of studying Chinese journals, doing leadership analyses, examining bureaucratic politics, reading diplomatic and military signals, using intelligence and academic theories, etc., to uncover what the plan is. Somehow, if we can unpack all this, then we'll know where China's going. But if there's one thing that's been evidenced by our own national experience, it's that foreign policy is far more reactive than this, and it's far more analogous to caretaking in an emergency room than closely following a long-term strategic plan. And just to drive this point home, think back to the 2000 presidential election here in the U.S. We had then-candidate George W. Bush in a debate declaring, "I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation building." We have Condoleezza Rice writing in the January-February 2000 edition of Foreign Affairs, and I quote, "The President must remember that the military is a special instrument. It is lethal, and it is meant to be. It is not a civilian police force. It is not a political referee, and it is most certainly not designed to build a civilian society." Now, I bring these quotes up not to pick on the Bush administration, but rather to present a clear example of an instance where we had complete information about the preferences and goals of leaders and government, and they still provided very little guidance on the future principal priorities and behavior of the United States. So this is a long way of saying that the rise of China is not only about the preferences or strategies of Beijing, not just about what they're planning and preparing for, but about the threats and challenges they will face regardless of their own intentions. And in the short time I have today, let me walk through China's future threat environment as I see it. Now, I see three principal threats coming down the pipe for China. Number one, international terrorism against Chinese interests. Number two, gross instability abroad, where China holds key economic and security interests. And number three, the emergence of explicitly anti-Chinese governments. So I'll start with international terrorism. And here, again, I'm talking about attacks against Chinese interests abroad, not domestic terrorism. And the sources of this are multiple. Number one, the mistreatment or perceived mistreatment of Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We've seen threats from both al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda affiliates in Africa and in Asia in direct response to events such as the July 2009 riots in Xinjiang. And then beyond issues related directly to the Uyghurs, another potential source of terrorism is Chinese support for repressive Muslim governments. And one thing that's interesting here is that despite the fact that China has been a very careful study of the U.S. experience, they're committing the same sins and walking into the same traps of helping to prop up some of the most oppressive regimes in the world. And China's burgeoning relationship with Saudi Arabia is a case in point that will, in my view, eventually elicit terrorist attacks against Chinese interests abroad. Beyond Islamic extremism, another potential source of terrorism is the extraction of natural resources, commonly seen by domestic populations as a national affront. And again, we've seen this in Africa in particular. A second emergent threat lies in the potential for gross instability overseas, where China has core economic and security interests. So what drives this dynamic? I think principally, as we all know, Beijing has chosen to partner with some of the most unstable and isolated regimes in the world: Burma, Zimbabwe, Sudan, Angola, Iran, the list goes on. And we have a sort of good sense of why this is. China has energy and resource needs. They were a relative latecomer to international politics, and they've been relatively willing to shield these regimes from international pressure as part of a larger effort at the UN and the SCO and elsewhere to push norms of non-intervention because of their own domestic political abuses, as well as claims over Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang. The net result of working with these regimes, however, is more than just a normative deficit. Beijing's interests are increasingly becoming vulnerable to instability in these countries, whether wrought by civil war, regime change, external pressures, or otherwise. The third threat is not just instability per se, but the emergence of explicitly anti-Chinese populist or revolutionary regimes. So why will regimes turn on China? Again, this is related to Beijing's close relations with oppressive or non-democratic regimes. Note that some of the most vexing problems for the United States during the Cold War and since have been the result of U.S. support for autocratic regimes, whether in Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, and the list goes on. Should China's current partners today fall, subsequent governments may seek to punish Beijing for supporting the previous non-democratic regimes. In further exacerbating popular discontent towards China are Chinese business practices, which sometimes spread goodwill, but sometimes spread low wages, local corruption, poor safety standards, and an influx of cheap Chinese goods. And we should expect that political entrepreneurs, as they already have, will increasingly start using nationalist or xenophobic strategies in ways that result in anti-Chinese governments. So those are what I see as the emergent external threats that will confront China and will shape China's national security priorities and behavior: international terrorism, gross instability in key partners, and the rise of anti-Chinese governments. And let me just conclude with this. The real problem for China is that these problems in part do stem from what I would just consider the natural growing pains of being a rising power. But they're also due to the particularities of Chinese foreign policy. Does Beijing realize that these threats are out there? Of course they do. And the PLA has been paying increasing attention to preparing for operations beyond Taiwan, preparing for non-traditional security threats and military operations other than war. But here's the kicker as I see it. Because of the immediate economic and political exigencies of domestic political stability and economic growth in China, combined with the real resource needs it faces, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for China to unwind the policies that are leading to the rise of these external threats. I honestly do not see any way out for Beijing. So instead, I see the rise of these threats as nascent, as mounting, and as inevitable. And I would argue that their emergence will dictate the direction of China's rise and China's future behavior as much as, if not more than, Beijing's strategic intentions.